Okay, hello everyone. My name is Ahmet and I'm the head of R&D at Tech. I'm going to be your host for this session, and in this session we're going to be poking the enterprise bear. Whilst API governance has evolved, we think, significantly over the years with well-established and continually evolving patterns and practices, event governance we don't think has followed that same path. So events and event management has always been present but hasn't quite matured as APIs have. And to explore this further, we've invited Sven. Sven is a senior director within the office of the CTO at Solus. Sven and I have been collaborating together over the past year or so to try to help solve this kind of problem. And it was a no-brainer to invite him to share some of his extensive experience in this world of event-driven architectures and I suppose perspectives on the governance challenges that enterprises face. So please join me in welcoming Sven from Solus. Over to you, Sven.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. And not much to add actually in terms of introductions. So I'm just going to share my screen and we'll get going. So yeah, as mentioned, I'm going to talk about governance across APIs, event APIs, and events today. So a couple of things that I'm going to cover is first of all, why is API governance becoming so relevant, right? So it's an established space, like we used to call it API management at some stage. And so it's been established, or it's becoming more prominent, but it's been established, right? So, and then a big part of why we're talking about API governance is API sprawl. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit about generally how we look at API or at governance, enterprise architecture, API governance, and what are helpful metaphors for that and what aren't. So I typically this goes to, you've seen these things on LinkedIn as well, like the posts oh, this is bad enterprise architecture or this is bad governance, and there's a specific picture next to it, and we get to that, right? And I arrive at an idea of what governance should look like, or what's a better metaphor to think about how we establish governance in organizations. And then we pivot to events. And first of all, why do we need to think about events and event APIs? Because it's as Amit mentioned, it's kind of it's still compared to the API space, or traditional API space, relatively newcomer, right? But we find out there are things like this happen already in anyone who's using event brokers and messaging brokers and event distribution platforms. They already have something that is exactly as bad as API sprawl. I call it event sprawl. So we talk about that a little bit, and then we need to bring that together because in my view, event governance, event API management, or event API governance and API governance all need to come together. And so we need to get this newcomer onto the stage of API governance. So preparing for the talk, I went through webcasts and podcasts just to kind of tune into what people are saying about API governance, and I found this quote, or this I transcribed it from a webcast. So it's when people think about, oh, we have got API sprawl, actually this is no big deal, because this is what we encourage people to do. Everywhere in our organization, development teams and subsidiaries, business units, to build services, reusable services. So you do that and you enable people to do that, you just end up with a lot of services, and we need to deal with it, right? So it is actually a joyous occasion, and not oh my God, we have a problem and we have to deal with it, right? And so we need API governance across all of these things. We have all these multiple API management systems in many organizations, shadow and ghost APIs, all this kind of stuff, right? We need something, and what would that look like? And then oftentimes, when we think about, if you stick with this API sprawl being a negative, a negatively connotated concept, then we think oh my God, this is what our API landscape looks like, right? So this is and this is why I said when you've seen these on LinkedIn, oh my God, look at that, this is how bad governance looks like, or this is no, but here an enterprise architect should look at this at some stage, right, and fix it. And the implication then is that, yeah, what we actually need is this, so well laid out, generously proportioned, well-planned infrastructure that can take anything that you throw at it, and everything is actually constrained. There's clear contracts between everything, clear quality standards, and so on, right? And what that overlooks is three things. Number one, This works when it's flat, when there's a lot of land and it's flat, and there's not much that's been there before, so you lack legacy. And the reality is, like, if we aspire to that as a goal of governance, we may like set ourselves up for failure, right? Because the reality may not look like this Bangkok street, but it may look like this village that I grew up in, where you see the impact of topology, the environment, the impact of years and years of legacy, and the impact of modernization as well, right? So there is some order in here, but like we need to, when we think about governance, we need to think about what is realistic, what we can achieve. And there's actually an aspect to, like, if we think about everything in this kind of like the well laid out North American suburb type environment, we actually, this kind of environment you can set up when we make an assumption about the people and the organizations that set that up. So that works really well if there's a lot of control and a lot of ways to ensure compliance, right? So you have an organization that's tightly run where everyone knows what they're doing. You can set up clear guidelines, everyone will follow them, otherwise they'll be in a problem. They'll have problems, right? And that may work, like I argue development teams, and especially when you go for like an API first microservices approach, with lots of this development teams embedded in business units, embedded in IT factories, in factories, in enterprise IT and so on, right? You'll end up with you end up with something different. Like your organization doesn't work like the military. And then we think like we as like imposing governance is kind of like they're all knowledge workers. We get them all on the same page, get them in tune, and we'll get a symphony of services and APIs that work together. Right. And I think especially again, because like you empower development teams to build things and build new APIs in an agile way, creating new things as they go along, right? This is more like akin to actually having rock bands, and we actually hire rock stars, right? When we think about like we hire rock star architects and rock star developers, and of course we get rock bands, and like good luck putting like 100 rock bands on one stage and getting something that sounds good. So this is a different mindset we need to have to approach to get everyone to play along nicely, and that's for me is like more we need to think about what we do as stage management, getting like a good lineup, like so getting all our APIs in one place, making sure everyone shows up, ensure some sort of minimum standards, so stage times when you go off, when you go off, when you go on, when you go off, and also there, and of course with security in mind, because of course everything like that needs to happen needs to be secure here, right? So if you think about it like in organizational terms, like we need to think about organizations as being in flux and in transformation, and that comes with uncertainty, complexity, and chaos. And we can either fight it or we can embrace it and enable it to make good things happen, right? So that's kind of the mindset shift I see, where I think let's talk about this more as API stage management that enables a great developer experience rather than governance. And that means things like ensuring minimum standards across APIs. And that may actually just be your open API is valid for the beginning, right? So like we're staging an amateur festival maybe at the beginning. Adding documentation so the developer experience gets better. Some light touch lifecycle management. All of these APIs will have some sort of lifecycle management under the covers. So we need to get a lifecycle management across it, so more in terms of curating the APIs that we offer to developers. And as I said, security is always paramount. So of course we need to think about that. And from my point of view, we end up at a federation or marketplace for APIs when we think about that. So that's kind of setting the context and kind of dealing with one of those bugbears as well, because I've seen too many memes of like, oh, look at this ramshackle building. They need an enterprise architect and proper governance. So what has this got to do with, or where does event API governance come in? So you could actually say, like, we've just heard Kin Lane talk about this, like 25 years of REST APIs. This is a lot of legacy and a lot of established processes and a lot of learnings and a lot of success, right? On the EDA side, it's just emerging, right? So async API is a standard, and I didn't put Open API on here, but Open API is what now, like 10, 15 years old or something like that, right? Async API is maybe 5 or 6 years old. So this is a different legacy, right? So you may think why do we bother with this right now? Because this seems like a laggard, and maybe we should just bother with it when it becomes relevant. And I see like 3 reasons why we should bother with it now. The first thing is like, we don't want to make things worse, right? So we already have, like, if you think, like, we have already the API governance problem with traditional REST APIs, the APIs problem or challenge. Why should we ignore the next point, the next source of API sprawl, right? So we just creating, by ignoring one thing, we just create another problem down the line, right? And then if we're thinking about like consistency is one of the things we want to accomplish with API governance, and then the consistency should be across all API styles, in my view, right? So if you have like events, like if you say you can create an order and you can subscribe to updates on your order. So for instance, if an order has shipped, right, why does this event that I'm receiving from an event API, does it need to look the same or similar than the order that I've submitted in the first place, right? So these type of things come into play. Namespaces, how do you address like resource URLs versus topics on brokers and things like that, right? So there's this consistency aspect that we need to bring across all API styles and also, of course, GraphQL and others. And then the third point is that we actually, like, what people don't realize is that there is actually a lot of event sprawl already in organizations, and it's actually worse than API sprawl. And it's time to look at that now, right, for many of our customers. So what's event sprawl and where does it come from? So event sprawl essentially stems from the fact that like the event based communications are often treated as an infrastructure concern. So if services talk to each other via REST APIs, and at some stage you need to decouple things, it becomes more a technical discussion. Hey, I need access to a broker so I can publish this event. Hey, I need a queue so I can consume that event. So it all becomes very infrastructure centric, which also means it becomes very much a middleware inside out approach, because the middleware team who's looking after these precious broker resources thinks about resource allocations and security on a very like bit by bit basis, say on a discrete event basis, right? So which topic do we need? Which queue do we need? Which access controls do we need? It becomes it's all very technical driven. There is not much interlock with what happened, why this is happening, what the application team is doing, what payloads are actually being pumped through your brokers. So it becomes, we have these like, very, very discrete events, and everything is loosely coupled and complex. And all of that leads to, as I just already mentioned, to this disconnect between the infrastructure, the application, and the business purpose. So a lot of like what you typically, when you look at an EDA estate, like a lot of brokers inside an organization, you will actually you can discover like the technical infrastructure. You cannot discover much about like what applications actually are talking to each other and why, and what are they sending to each other, right? So that's the event sprawl problem. And I like just double click on the third aspect, the discrete events, because that really I think kind of illustrates why this is becoming why event sprawl is a bit is unpleasant. If you think about the REST world, you have like very clearly defined patterns, right? You have your resource URLs, you have HTTP verbs that are aligned with your create, read, update, delete operation. So and it's really incredibly hard to break out of that pattern. And it's also very applicable for a lot of situations, right? So this is very simple and very intuitive to understand. And you actually don't need an open API to understand what I've just written there, right? On a high level. Of course, OpenAPI will add a lot more detail and will be a lot more helpful, but like this helps us a lot just to understand how REST works. If you decompose that into events, the same resource, you see that you end up with multiple commands, and then with events that will be sent out in response to these commands. And then you'll see, so then you could keep this as a CRUD pattern, but no one's forcing you to do that. And if we're talking about events here, so they may have like business relevance, right? It's not like, oh, an order's been updated. We could actually say like, oh, we pump out an event when an order is picked, when it's shipped, when it's delivered, when it's canceled. So people can listen into a specific part of this life cycle. So this gives us a lot of power, but good luck exploring that and finding out that all of these events that on these topics are related to each other and what they look like, right? And that really is the issue with event sprawl. And we're addressing this essentially by thinking about like we need to how we from a conceptual point address this is to say we need to think about these discrete events because that's what our reality is like, and we could kind of discover discrete events or some information about the events that flow through our event distribution platform, whatever it may be. We can get some basic information about events and catalog them. But then, and we could also go with the traditional approach, kind of like saying, oh, this is a service that consumes this event and sends that event. So we could go down that route. But we also see that like where this, like the event API space comes in is where we say like, yeah, all these events that we actually not, that are relatively like disparate, they're all related to each other. So how can we kind of capture the fact that they're related and how can we put them together into consumable units? And that's the event API and like so a concept of event API products that help us do that. And that brings order into the event sprawl and it creates reusable components that allow developers to easily understand them and get access to them and reduces the cognitive load on the developers, right? So as I said, like how do we govern this now? One aspect, and this is what our analysts are talking about, is the tooling aspect. So they all seem to agree that like we need to have some sort of event management, event governance capabilities, and event API management capabilities. And they all seem to agree as well that like while there's a lot of similarities, there's also differences. So we need to learn a lot from how API management evolved and what API management does well. And we need to take into account what's different about events than traditional APIs. And Gartner lists a couple of things here, like you need to take these API management principles, but you need to apply them very granular on events, schemas, topic design, and not on a service or API level, which we're more accustomed to when we're coming from the REST world. So how do we address it? Tools is one part of the equation, right? So as a product, working for a product vendor, of course, this is what I'm going to tell you. There's a product called Solus Event Portal, and that brings approaches together to combat event sprawl or address event sprawl. And it allows like two approaches. One is to deal with discrete events, just essentially taking what people have been doing in the EDA space on the middleware side, like from this middleware inside out centric approach, and putting it into a governance framework. And we also added the capability then to make more order of or put more order into these events by combining them into event APIs and getting them up and publishing them into places where developers already are, right? So that's the tooling side of it. But as I already talked about, like in the beginning, like the governance is a lot about people and processes. So what I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about like what we've learned when we applied the tooling to Event Portal and what we need to do around this with processes and people and how this needs to tie in with API governance. So people and processes are important. We need to look at we need to engage with the teams that actually develop functionality. So stream-aligned app teams. We need to look at the platform teams, at the broker operators, middleware, DevOps teams. We need to look at enabling functionalities like governance teams, data architecture, enterprise architect teams. And we need to figure out how do they work together today? So who works together within all of these groups? How do they work together? What information is currently captured? What tools and processes do they already have in place? And how can we hook into these processes and existing automations as well, right? And that leads us when we introduce Solus Event Portal, we start with actually looking at like people, processes, and tools. And we advise our customers to engage with API teams in first and foremost. Not exclusively, of course, because I said we look at everyone, but we need to engage with the API teams, with Center of Excellence, API product managers, and so on. And that's because oftentimes API teams are more outward oriented. So they have a better visibility of like, why are they building things? They're closer to like, so they're close to like the business capabilities, the business value they provide. And so we understand why we are doing things. And we also have an understanding of like how they need to get this like business value is derived from people reusing functionality or using what you've built. So they have an idea of like also how to bring things to market and bring internally, like in internal usage, external usage, APIs as products and so on, right? So we can learn a lot from that. Whereas the middleware teams tend to be inward oriented, right? So that's why we look at all of these, or why we kind of really focus also on, or would advise to focus on the API management and API governance capabilities that are in place. And that avoids to be an island, and it leverages what already has been built within the within the organization. So in regards to software development life cycles, API management and governance, CI/CD tooling, how do we need to fit into these components, right? So who drives and who should, like, of course, everyone should be in the seat, but like the middleware team has a valid concern in improving their processes and having control and governance of the middleware platform, of the event broker platform. But it needs to go hand in hand with the development teams and architects, because we need to fit into existing processes, as I've already said. So a couple of things, how we actually do that from a like, it's still my kind of more conceptual point of view. So we essentially have these, we say event API management capabilities need to be within a specific capability. That's, for instance, PubSub Plus event portal. This is where you manage your discrete events and package them into event APIs. And then you need to get them on the stage where all the other stuff is. So this is where API governance, unified API management, API marketplaces, developer portals, and so on come in. So we can get the rest, add our async APIs to the lineup of open API, essentially, or REST APIs that are already there, right? And all with the goal to get developers, empower developers to get access to event-driven APIs, REST APIs, so they can build the applications they need to build that are more responsive and more real-time without the need for complex interaction with open APIs to constantly retrieve updates and hope that there's something has changed, right? So that's the one thing. That's the kind of design time and the developer experience type governance. And then, of course, I talked about consistency and security. So from my point of view, we'd also need to look at how do we kind of enforce specific consistent security controls across all our APIs. So we have a layer where we say, this is where you get your credentials from. They apply to all of these different platforms and different APIs that you have access to, and you can connect to them in a uniform way, or at least authenticate in a uniform way and get authorized in a uniform way, right? So that's the loop back from the developer experience. When the developer says, I want to have access, that needs to happen and needs to happen consistently across the estate. So that really wraps it up for me. Kind of quick recap. First, we need to look at governance as an organizational change, and there are some lessons that we also learned, like from a tool vendor perspective, putting event portal into place. We need to focus on much more than just kind of putting a tool in place and telling people to use it, right? So event governance needs to be inclusive, it needs to include different API styles, and need to be able to evolve to accommodate new API styles and bring these things all together in one developer experience. And governance needs to be an enabling functionality rather than a controlling and prohibitive kind of functionality that people want to circumvent, right? I've also talked about event governance, so that must follow specific principles. It's not the same, it's very similar, but there are crucial differences, and it must plug into API governance overall, because at the end of the day, developers need to have the tool set available to them to build what they need to build, right? And all of that leads us to really like these API federation or marketplaces approaches. So thanks for listening today. I'm just going to stop my screen share, and how do I do that here? Cool.
Thank you very much, Sven. That was an absolutely amazing talk. Thank you very much for that. I've got lots and lots of questions, but I see I'll ask some of my own in a moment. A question from Kyle. He asked, what capabilities do you think we should see from these toolings that are lacking right now?
Well, the thing is, so I make a couple of assumptions here that it means like what on the event on an event governance type of functionality, right? So I think like this is really an evolving space, and it is its capabilities are like, I think we like with Event Portal, we actually provide quite a lot of these capabilities already, right? But it's like there are capabilities that you need to discover what's on your brokers, what is flowing through your event mesh. There's capabilities where you actually like need to can at least manage, if not design schemas, but manage your schemas, manage your topic namespaces, manage manage how resource allocation should happen on the broker. So these type of things. And tying that together, that's essentially what Event Portal provides. And I think like we see more and more products evolve in that space.
Okay, thank you. And a question from me. You showed an example of what looked to me, because I'm from the REST API world or the API world, a bunch of REST APIs, and you kind of compared that with events. I mean, are there literally no naming conventions, or do they try and generally map those to RESTful kind of style topics? And leading on from that, I think we've all heard of async API specifications, but how is adoption? How are you seeing adoption of async API as a specification? Are organizations even using it?
Yeah, so we start with like there, of course, people have naming conventions, and every like organization has some sort of naming conventions. I have either one or many, right? But the thing is, like, these are conventions, right? The REST API, like, this is how a REST API works. Like, you can't really do much different. Like, the pattern is a given, right? That I've demonstrated on the left. The pattern on the right on that slide is essentially something that people have agreed to do, and people like so people could align with REST patterns, or they like with HTTP verbs, or they could invent their own verbs, or it is just very much more free form, right? And part of that is like, of course, it's not only down to like, oh, REST forces you to do certain things, but it's also like the 25 years of heritage where like the combination of REST and it's kind of like the scaffolding it provides, plus all the conventions kind of make this all very standardized. Whereas in the EDA space, it is very it's not very standardized, right? It's all down to conventions and people in specific circumstances agreeing on naming conventions. And that's where, going back to async API, this is where async API becomes why async API is much more crucial to events than Open API is crucial to REST, because from looking at from these events, and like I use descriptive topic names, but you'll see like loads of cryptic because it's middleware, right? So there's organized, this will be optimized for, like there will be cryptic naming conventions. They're usually not, or often they're not as descriptive as URIs, right? So you need async API to tie this all together. And for us, like from my point of view, this will not work without async API, because async API is the only way, this API specification is the only way to document what belongs together from all these discrete events that you've got.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This has been an amazing session. For everybody else who's here, I think there's a break. There's a bit of a break for about 15 minutes or so. And after Tyke's got a session introducing our AI studio. And then there's also a panel discussion as well about an API governance strategy. So thank you very much, Sven. And I hope everyone enjoyed the session.
Thank you so much for having me.